Hello, and thanks for joining us on Encore. Coming up on today's show, we give girls such tiny real estate to exist in, they deserve books that reflect their full humanity. Our guest today, Emma Cline, gives a voice to the young women caught up in the cultish movement at the centre of her debut novel. The Girls is inspired by the notorious Manson family murders of the 1960s. Emma Cline, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Well, your debut novel, The Girls, is the gripping story of a young woman caught up in a cult-ish movement with a man at its centre. So who are these girls?
Yeah, the girls of the title, they're in Northern California. It's 1969. They're a group of semi-feral girls living in an abandoned ranch, and their leader is this charismatic man. But to me, the story, really shifts the focus from the man at the center and focuses on the dynamics between the women and girls around him.
Mm-hmm. And I hear that the story itself had some real life inspiration.
Yeah, I'm from Northern California, and such a big part of California mythology is all the communes and groups, and the Manson family is one of them. Jonestown is another group that started in California. So I was trying to engage with them in a way I hadn't seen before, which was from the perspective of a young girl.
Now, the book does touch on the intensity of female relationships, especially the validation required during adolescence. I certainly recognise that period of life. Why did you want to revisit that period?
I think adolescence is such a time of extremes, and like you're saying, feelings are black and white, and you have these really pure ideals at that moment too. And so I saw some resonance between the adolescence extreme feelings and the desire to be part of something larger, to be part of this commune.
Mm-hmm. Could you perhaps read us a passage that sums up that?
Back then, I was so attuned to attention. I dressed to provoke love, tugging my neckline lower, settling a wistful stare on my face whenever I went out in public that implied many deep and promising thoughts should anyone happen to glance over. As a child, I had once been part of a charity dog show and paraded around a pretty collie on a leash, a silk bandana around its neck. How thrilled I'd been at the sanctioned performance, the way I went up to strangers and let them admire the dog, my smile as indulgent and constant as a salesgirl's, and how vacant I'd felt when it was over, when no one needed to look at me anymore. I waited to be told what was good about me. I wondered later if this was why there were so many more women than men at the ranch. All that time I had spent readying myself, the articles that taught me life was really just a waiting room until someone noticed you. The boys had spent that time becoming themselves.
Now, the women in this novel seem to have a bad time, mainly at the hands of male characters, most of whom are less than sympathetic, I think. It's quite a bleak picture in terms of sexism, but it is the late 60s. How far do you think we've moved on since then?
Yeah, in the contemporary frame around the story that's set in the 60s, there's also a young female character. So by putting those two things together, I did want to think a lot about what has changed and what hasn't. And for me, I think what I was interested in is what's universal about adolescence. And for me, that really was that kernel of longing to be seen, to be noticed. And I think in a lot of ways, things have gotten better, but the logistics have changed. I think social media is an interesting way to think about that act of being seen or that desire. It's more literalized.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Manson family killings that you mentioned, they have passed into sort of mythology, of folklore in America. There's a lot of morbid interest in them. Why do you think there's this fascination with Charles Manson as a figure?
Yeah, both my parents grew up in California, so for them it was a very pivotal moment of their adolescence. And the way they explained it to me growing up was that it was the first moment they realized that their homes, these spaces that seemed sacred and inviolable, were somehow suddenly vulnerable to violence. It was the first time that violence became real to them. So I thought a lot about that as a kind of loss of innocence and then putting that next to the teenage girl's loss of innocence as well.
And in doing your research for the book, it's very well documented. Did you find some material too difficult to deal with? Because it's very violent.
Yeah, I think for me the challenge was, could I write a book with a murder in it and make it almost the least important part of the book, and really try to focus more on the psychological violence and sort of the everyday violence of just being a girl in the world. So for me, it was about how do you do it without being salacious or sordid.
And in terms of this figure, this male figure at the centre of the cult, Charles Manson in the true story and Russell in your story, how do you think he managed to seduce and manipulate people to the extent that he did?
Yeah, in this book, Evie really wants to be seen, wants to be known, and Russell is someone who knows how to perfectly manipulate that desire and to give the impression of a pure, particular kind of love.
Now, you grew up, as you said, in Northern California, and this book is rooted in the hippie atmosphere of the 1960s. How do you feel that legacy today in the state?
Yeah, I mean, California is still dealing with the 60s in so many ways. It's kind of in a hangover from the 60s still. There's still a lot of communes and groups in operation, none as murderous, I don't think. But yeah, I think the 60s was this time of high idealism when everyone really believed the world could change. And then when it didn't change as much as people wanted, I think that's where I became interested in. And that's the legacy I grew up with, is sort of the reality of the 60s. So I really wanted to interrogate that nostalgia.
Mm-hmm. Now, The Girls is your first novel to be published, and after a notorious bidding war when you were just 25, you've had other successes very early, and the media obviously likes to make much of you being a precocious talent. Do you worry about peaking this early in your career?
I think I really tried to remind myself that I would have written this book even if no one wanted to read it. It's a book that really speaks to things that resonate for me. And so the noise that came afterwards, I just feel like it's not even my business at a certain point. It runs parallel to me but doesn't intersect with the reality of me as a writer or even the book in a way.
Very sensible. Now, you started writing very young, as a child. What drove you to put pen to paper?
I'm from a very big family. I'm one of 7 children. A little cult, but again, less murder. So I read from a very young age. For me, it was a way to have private space, kind of a mental silence that I wasn't getting in a house full of kids. So writing came really naturally out of that.
Okay. Now, this book's been optioned for a film. The writing is very visual, very evocative when you're reading it. You have some experience in Hollywood as a child actor. Do you see yourself making the transition to writing for screen?
They asked if I wanted to be involved with the script, but for me, as a writer, I've gone as far as I want to go with these characters, and I'm interested in a new challenge.
You wouldn't want to do that perhaps in the future?
I don't think so. Maybe.
It's not your medium. Now, you're somebody who would be part of what's called the millennial generation, and we do tend to associate that with social media, but you don't seem to have Twitter or Instagram, any of that. Why that choice?
I think for me, it's just about what environment can I create that helps me write, and I like having a certain amount of mental silence, and being able to limit my exposure to that kind of stuff has been really helpful for me.
Mental silence and physical silence, because I heard that you write in a shed. Do you still write in a shed?
I do. I actually lived in the shed for a long time, so that's just where I lived and wrote. It was kind of the perfect place to write a book because there was no internet and it was very small. There's basically nothing to do but write a book.
Sounds almost cultish.
Right.
We're finishing off with one of your cultural tips of the moment, the film A Bigger Splash, starring Ralph Fiennes and Tilda Swinton. This is a remake of the French film La Piscine. What is it that grabs you about this film?
To me, it was really the mood and atmosphere. It's a lot about power and sex, which are themes I'm really interested in. And then just visually, it's so lush.
Okay. Well, it's certainly a dark vision of a Mediterranean holiday. Emma Cline, thanks so much
Thank you so
for
much.
joining us. Just a reminder that your novel, The Girls, is available in English and now in French. We'll leave you with a clip of this dark version of a Mediterranean holiday. Remember to check out our website. You can also follow Encore on our social media channels. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
You're obscene.
We're all obscene. Everyone's obscene. That's the whole point.